Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar. It's a great Friday afternoon to just be curled up at home with a book or with an online seminar with this weather that we've been having. Let's go ahead and get started. We are very excited to have Dr. Grote with us. He is a classics professor at UNCC. He has been teaching classics there for over 20 years. And he's also the author of the Comprehensive Guide to Wheelock's Latin. Dale grew up in western Iowa. He earned his master's degree in Greek from the University of Iowa and then a PhD in classics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison.
Okay, I just changed the microphone. Okay, good. I was just explaining that you were a student of mine in the late 90s in my Latin class, and then you've come back and I found that you were involved in this homeschooling curricula and all of that, and I thought that was great. We've been talking about online Latin and that. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago I was the president of the North Carolina Classical Association, and I brought in all of you homeschool people who were doing online teaching, and you told us what you were doing, and I was, really there's a lot of energy in homeschooling Latin and homeschooling Greek that I really wish we academicians could tie into. So bravo, everybody. Great. Well, let me tell you what I'm going to do, if I can get this to work. Okay, I'm trying to get to my first slide here. Beth, what am I doing? I want to get to the PowerPoint that I put up. Okay, good. I tell you what I'll do. I really want to hear your questions, but I'll talk about a few things that come up frequently and people will ask me about with regard to Latin and Greek. And one of them is a real question is, which Greek and which Latin should we begin with? What should we study? And another question I get is, what's the relationship between Latin and Greek? So I'll just talk for about 10 minutes, tell you what I think, and then I'd like to hear what your questions are, and then what you think too. So to begin, we're going to talk about which Latin and which Greek, and let's lay out how do I get the next slide here? Beth, could you go to the next slide for me? The next one should be a picture. It should be a map. That's it. I'm just trying to download to my computer. There it is. I've got what you should be seeing now is this map. It says Proto-Indo-European. Can everybody see that? Yes. Okay. Good. All right. A question that I get is, well, what is the relationship between Greek and Latin? Does Latin come from Greek? And the answer is they are sister languages within the same family. And this map here shows the diffusion of the earlier language that eventually produces both Greek and Latin. About 2000 BC, this is our best estimate, 2000 BC, from this area in Russia, which is in purple there, or pink, started to move out. We don't know anything about them other than the fact that they brought their language wherever they went, and it became the basis of all of these different languages around the world. And you can see one arrow goes into Greece, and then another arrow kind of goes around modern-day Yugoslavia and into Italy, and that became Latin. So about 2,000 years ago, this language group, which we call Proto-Indo-European, started to spread out, and it became the basis of a number of world languages. Next slide here. I'm not getting any response from my screen. I'm sorry, Beth. Yeah, I need the next slide here. And it was discovered because the British, were in India, and so they sent over their leaders, and they had all been educated in Greek and Latin. And when they started to learn the languages in India, they said, well, this looks like Greek and Latin. And so further being discovered this whole tree of languages that emanate out of Indo-European. And we've skipped over one slide, but that's okay. This is good. You can see here one of the branches leads to Latin. That's okay. What leads to, there we go, perfect. Leads to Latin, and so that's what we're interested in here. Latino-Etruscan, and then that goes down to Latin, and then off to the left you see classical Latin, and then vulgar Latin or Vulgate Latin. And then Vulgar Latin then scatters into the Romance languages of or the major Western European Romance languages, and lots of other smaller ones as well. So your question is, what about Vulgate and Classical Latin, and what's the relationship? What are they like with regard to one another? And more specifically, if we're going to start to teach Latin, we begin. So the next slide then. Here we go. Oh, this is working out really well. Okay, well here's what happened with Latin. You see the V there off to the left. That stands for Vulgar or Vulgate Latin, the Latin of the people, common spoken language. And it's the assumption that Latin started as one unified language spoken by a small town in the middle of Italy, which eventually then, next slide then, which eventually the Roman people got in contact with the Greeks, and they began to develop a literary style based on their Greek models that they admired so much. And so to continue its history down like that, and that was an arrow that was going off to the right, it's going to continue its history. And then emerging from that, good, and now the next slide. And then emerging from that over the top of it is this Classical Latin. It's pretty clear that nobody ever spoke Classical Latin in the streets. You know, even Cicero's speeches, which he gave in the Senate, were rewritten. It's not the way it sounded when he delivered them. And so it's a highly polished style. So you can see the C kind of emerging out of the V, and they sort of go in parallel. You might want to know how to know anything about Vulgate, if it's not written down anywhere, if it's not available to us, because we studied the classical texts. How do we know anything about Vulgate Latin and its history? Next slide then. Well, one of the ways we know it is from things like this, and that's an inscription. And so we see kind of a trail of spoken common Latin. Actually, this is not an inscription, it's graffiti. And so this is the Vox Populi, and that gives us an idea of what Latin was really like in the streets, not in the literary salons or at the poet's workshop, but in the streets. Right, so we can look at graffiti. Next slide. And so we get a pretty good map of Vulgate Latin or spoken Latin. Another source is early Latin, and we have one really great author, Plautus, was an early 3rd century BC Roman author, and he was writing in the ordinary language of the people. Even though it was poetry, he still used a lot of forms that sort of get pushed out of the way during the classical period, but they are, next slide then. There we go. And if you want, you can go look at this old classical library of Old Latin. We've got Livius Andronicus, Nevius, Pacuvius, Aequius. Mainly they're writing about farms and history and that sort of thing. But it's really interesting to look at these old forms because if you studied classical Latin or try to teach classical Latin, you'll look at this and you think, ooh, this is really bizarre. It's odd. But that's what the Roman forms, the Latin forms were before this literary effort took place. And it starts to take place in the late 2nd century BC, when you have these great authors, you know, Lucretius and Virgil and the rest. Next slide then.